Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Amazon QuickSight Learning Series. This is a weekly learning session, which is hosted by the QuickSight team, where you get to learn about product functionalities, new feature launches, best practices, and tips how to improve your user experience to gain technical knowledge from our QuickSight solution architects and product managers. Today's session will be on security best practices with QuickSight. This is presented by our solutions architect, Olivia Carline, who's based out of Australia. And therefore, because of the time zone differences, we will be using a presentation recording that she did exclusively for this session. And I will be broadcasting that today for your learning. Before we do that, quickly wanted to talk you through about our QuickSight community. It's a one-stop shop to our BI journey. It's a place where you get all the resources, such as you can ask questions and answers. You can learn and see many videos. For example, this video will be uploaded here soon. There are a lot of new announcements and blog posts which will be put on the community, as well as you can keep track of what are the upcoming events. So recommend you taking a chance and registering for the community. You can take a snapshot of this screen or go on to community.amazonquicksite.com and register yourself if you haven't already done. Quick overview of our learning events. So we have this learning series which you are attending right now, Wednesdays 10 a.m. Pacific time and Thursdays 10 a.m. Central European time. Other than that, every first Friday we have a new features session. It's at 8:30 a.m. Pacific time. Second and third Wednesdays we have comprehensive immersion days. These are 6 hour long hands-on workshops um, that you can register. On third Wednesdays, we have the same immersion days, but for Europe, to address the European time. And fourth Thursdays, we have a live Q&A sessions with our solutions architect. So that session is exclusively for question and answers without a particular presentation. So let's talk about how to ask questions for this session. We will have questions specific to this session taken on the QuickSight, Amazon QuickSight community. So you need to have signed up there. And once you go to that community, and I will walk you through also right now how to do that, you can go to the question and answers page and use this particular tag when marking your question, which is -QLS, sorry, #QLS-security. That way, our experts on the community will know that the question is coming for this session and prioritize answering that. The recording for this session will be available on our QuickSight community as well as our YouTube channel, as is for all our sessions. So keep checking that. We generally post that there within 1 week of the session being done. And now let me take you to a quick overview of the community website and show you how to ask questions. This is the QuickSight community. As you can see, I'll just take this out. Community.amazonquicksite.com. Once you register, you will be able to access all the functionalities. You can use this categories menu here to navigate through the different sections, or we have created the tiles. We'll walk through the Q&A section today to show you how to ask questions, but let me also show you the Learning Center. So you click here, you'll get multiple resources. We have a curated list of getting started resources. We have some how-to videos. And the workshop videos section is where the recordings of such webinars as this will get posted. Also, I'll walk you through the event section because you'll need it to register for upcoming events. This is a list view, And if you click calendar, you can get a calendar view of what the events are. And I'll cover after our main presentation some of the upcoming event. So this is where you can come and register for. Now, how to ask a question. So as you saw, you go to the question and answer tile or the question and answer section from the menu bar and click new question. Okay. Now, once you click new question, you will get a pop-up field. Put in your question. I have a question. And for this session, just make sure you put the hashtag QLS-security and ask your question. Okay, so this is how you do this. It's simple, but just doing this way helps our expert track it and answer it in the most optimal manner. Okay, so now let's go back to our main presentation, which is on security best practices by Olivia Carline.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining me in this week's session of our Amazon QuickSight Learning Series. My name is Olivia Carline and I am a solutions architect based out of Melbourne, Australia. And I am so excited for today's session as we are going to be covering our highest priority at AWS, which is security. Before I get started, it's important to note that whenever we speak about security here at AWS, we often refer to a concept known as the shared responsibility model. With this model, security is a shared responsibility split between AWS and yourself, the customer. Essentially, AWS takes responsibility for security of the cloud, items such as securing the data centers and the global networking that are used by services such as QuickSight, while customers such as yourself are responsible for security in the cloud. This relates to items such as ensuring you've got the correct access controls in place for your users. Now, to help you with this, we've put together a list of best practices that you can use to make sure your QuickSight accounts are secure and help you to meet your side of the shared responsibility model. Let's get started by taking a look at data security within QuickSight, in particular, how we can encrypt our data. Now, for anyone who isn't too familiar with the concept of data encryption is simply the process of converting or translating our data into a format that only users or devices can decrypt if they have the secret key required. Because of that, data encryption is one of the most popular approaches we can take to secure our data. And when we talk about data encryption, we often break this down into encryption in transit or encryption at rest. Encryption in transit, also known as encrypting data in motion, refers to the process of encrypting our data when it is moving from one location to another. So, when we're looking at QuickSight, this could be the transfer of data from data sources such as an Aurora database or a Spark cluster, but it could also be referring to the transfer from Spice to our readers' dashboards. Now, this is different to the other type of encryption, which is known as encryption at rest. And as the name suggests, this type of encryption simply refers to encrypting data that's not actively moving and is instead stored on a device or a network. For QuickSight, data at rest could relate to our data that we're storing within Spice, or alternatively, it could relate to our query result cache or even our email reports. When it comes to encryption in transit, it's important to note that QuickSight supports encryption for all data transfers. However, this encryption isn't mandatory. And while the majority of our data sources, including Redshift and Athena, will have SSL encryption enabled, there are some database connections, including MySQL, where this encryption is optional And you can see this here in this screenshot. And that's really our first best practice. So when you are connecting to databases where this encryption is optional, it is our recommendation that you opt to enable SSL on your connection. And if you haven't heard of SSL before, SSL is an encryption security protocol, and it simply stands for Secure Sockets Layer. Now, we recommend enabling SSL as this can secure your data in motion and help protect that data transfer from any potential attackers. So when you are connecting to a database where SSL is optional, it's really important that you have a certificate which has been signed by a recognized certificate authority, or CA. Now, if you're not sure if your CA will be recognized, we do have a list of accepted public certificate authorities, and this is available in our public documentation. So you really want to make sure that your certificate is on this list, or else it won't work. That also means that QuickSight won't accept certificates that are self-signed or issued from a non-public CA, so do keep that in mind. So that was encryption in transit. But we also have to think about how we secure our data at rest within QuickSight. We can break our data at rest into our SPICE data and our non-SPICE data. Now, for today's session, we're really just going to be focusing on how we can secure that SPICE data. With the QuickSight Standard Edition, our SPICE data will be securely stored, however, it won't be encrypted. That's compared to a QuickSight Enterprise license, where our SPICE data is encrypted using block-level encryption with AWS managed keys. And this built-in encryption provides an additional layer of security and makes it virtually impossible for anyone to access our data. Simply leveraging this built-in encryption that comes with this enterprise license is typically enough for most of our customers. However, there might be times you want more control over your encryption keys. And this might be to satisfy regulatory requirements, or it might even just be to be able to actually securely audit your data. In situations like this, we can integrate QuickSight with another AWS service known as AWS Key Management Service. Now, AWS Key Management Service, also known as just KMS, can be used to encrypt our SPICE data sets, actually using our own keys that we control. So with this approach, we've got full control over the encryption keys that have been used to encrypt our data. And the benefit of this is that in the unlikely event that we have a security incident occurring, we've got the ability to actually revoke access and lock down those data sets with one simple click. On top of that, with our own customer managed keys, we can also maintain an auditable log that tracks how all of our customer managed keys, SPICE datasets are being accessed. Now, both of these can help us to increase security within our account, as well as satisfy any regulatory requirements that we might have. Now, while we're still focusing on data security, it's time to take a look at our next best practice, which is to leverage another one of QuickSight's service integrations, this time with a service known as AWS Secrets Manager. If you haven't heard of Secrets Manager before, it is a service that allows you to manage, retrieve, as well as rotate your database credentials, your API keys, and a whole range of other various secrets. Using Secrets Manager, we can store, manage, as well as rotate these secrets, and we can also refer to these secrets from other applications and services such as QuickSight. So with that QuickSight Enterprise license, as an admin user, we can go in and we can grant read-only access to secrets that we have created within Secret Manager. Now, the benefit of this is that for our author users who are trying to connect to a data source, they can now just refer to these secrets instead of putting in their credentials like their username and their password. And I want to call out that this approach will work with data source types that support credential pair authentication, but Jira and ServiceNow currently are not supported for the Secret Manager integration. Now, the reason we want our authors to use these secrets is it means now that we don't have to share database credentials with our BI team, configure these credentials for any of our users building out QuickSight datasets. They can instead refer to these secrets without needing to have the credentials and the usernames passwords. And on top of that, Secret Manager integration also comes with the benefit of automatic secret rotation. So with this, we can have the confidence of knowing that our credentials are being regularly updated and as such are going to be a lot less vulnerable. Still within the data space, our next best practice involves leveraging VPC connections where possible. What this means is if you have a QuickSight Enterprise license, you can securely connect to data that's available in your VPC. So that might be your Redshift cluster or an RDS database. You can also securely connect to databases that you might have hosted on premises. And this works by leveraging VPC connections in conjunction with Direct Connect or a virtual private network or even a proxy to securely connect to your data sources. Now, the reason we have this on our list is because doing your connection via these VPC connections doesn't expose these data sources to the public internet. And as such, it can help us to reduce the risk of any data breaches. The other really key benefit is by using these VPC connections, we get to benefit from other VPC security features, so security group rules, and we can use these to specify which IP addresses and ports are allowed to access these resources. And we can also work with network ACLs or NACLs, and these can help us to control traffic at this subnet level, both of which are really great at helping to prevent any unauthorized access to our underlying data source. Additionally, when it comes to VPC connections, we just released a new feature just last week, and with this, we now actually support multiple availability zones within your VPC connections. So previously, these connections could only be configured to be one availability zone. But with this latest release, these connections are configured across at least 2 availability zones, which helps you to provide high availability in the unlikely event of an AZ failure. Now, with that said, let's take a look at our next data security best practice. And this is all around row-level security. So if you haven't explored row-level security or RLS within QuickSight before, it is a very convenient approach that can be used to help us control our users' data access at the row level. If you have a QuickSight Enterprise license, you can configure RLS on your data sets, and this will restrict access to specific rows of our data to only the users who we have authorized to access them. And I do want to specify that RLS is applied at the dataset layer, because with this approach, all data sets, all analyses, and dashboards that are built off this data set will also have those row-level security rules in place. Now, the benefit of using RLS is that it can help us to reduce the risk of any data breaches and any unauthorized access. And that also helps us to meet the principle of least privilege, which is something I'll talk about later in this session. However, I do want to call out one other key benefit that's not security related, but using RLS, we're actually able to reduce our administrative overhead. So with RLS, we can have one central data set or one central dashboard based off that data set, which is then being shared out with all of the users within our account, all of the users who need to see that dashboard. We can do this instead of creating a separate data sets or separate dashboards that are being filtered and restricted to each individual user. So with RLS, basically we can have one central dashboard, and we don't have to deal with the complexity of managing multiple data sets or multiple dashboards. Just something to note, when it does come to row-level security within QuickSight, there are actually 2 different flavors. We can either go with a user-based approach or a tag-based approach. With user-based RLS, we define a permissions data set, and this permissions data set contains rules. These are set for individual columns, and they are either used for groups or for users. This is compared to tag-based, and with this approach, this is simply there if you are trying to embed QuickSight dashboards anonymously. And this works by passing through row-level security via tags. Now, as an example, if we had a sales dashboard, we could use row-level security to show only the data that is relevant to the specific users who need to see the sales dashboard. So in this case, we're going to go with a user-based approach. And so you can see on the screen, we've got this row-level security rules data set up here. We're going to go with QuickSight groups to restrict access, but we could also break this down into individual users or user ARN if we were working in a multi-tenanted environment using namespaces. And that's something I'll talk to shortly. However, the benefit of going with a groups approach is that it allows us to really easily scale as we increase the number of users in our account. Now, back to this example. So we might have that we only want users who are part of the EMEA sales team to be able to view the sales data that relates to the EMEA region. Essentially, don't view any data that belongs to APAC or US. And we'd have the same with our US and our APAC teams. We only want them to be able to view data that relates to the region they're in. We also might want to restrict on the segment. So maybe only certain users should be able to view certain segments, so either enterprise, SMB, or startup. Now, if we look at this data set here, basically this first row up here, this EMEA sales, is saying that users who belong to the EMEA sales group, they can only view data that relates to the EMEA region across all 3 segments. This is compared to users who belong to our US sales group. And on the other hand, these users are listed multiple times in this rules data set across different rows. With this, it's essentially saying that users who belong to the US sales group, they can see either data that relates to the US region in enterprise, or they can see data that relates to US in SMB and startup, or US in startup. So all of these rules work in conjunction together. Now, this is compared to the next group, if we scroll down to the corporate reporting. Now, this particular group, they've got empty fields for region and for segment. So in situations like this, where we have a row for a group or a user, but all of the other columns in our rules data set are null, this just gives users or this group access to all of the data. So users who belong to our corporate reporting group, they can see data across all 3 regions and across all 3 segments. Now, this is compared to if we had a group which actually isn't part of this rules data set. Now, let's say we had an HR group. Now, this means if they're not in this rules data set, they actually can't see any of the data at all. They'll get an access denied. Now, the other thing that's important when you're working with a user-based approach is if you share out a data set that has RLS applied on it with data set owners, those data set owners are still going to see all of the data. It's really only our readers and our end users and users of the data who aren't the data set owners that are going to be restricted by this permissions data set rules. So it's quite easy to see how row-level security can be leveraged to help ensure that our users are only able to view the data that they should be able to do with their job and that they are necessary to see. Now, next up, and it's very similar to row-level security, but we can also leverage column-level security with our data sets. And we can do this to lock down access to specific columns within our data. So like row-level security, the 2 key benefits that come from leveraging column-level security are enhanced security as well as the ease of administration. Now, this is useful in so many different use cases, but if we just take a very common example, and let's just say that we had an HR dashboard. Now, in this dashboard, there might be a whole range of different information that relates to our employees. So it could contain fields like the employee ID, what their department is, their tenure, and potentially their compensation. And this dashboard would be useful for a lot of our internal users to see and understand more about their colleagues. But there are some fields we really don't want everyone to be able to access, especially if they're a bit more confidential. So that compensation field, we don't want it to be open to everyone who can see that dashboard. So rather than creating a separate dashboard just for our HR users who have a real need to see this compensation data, what we can do is we can set up column-level security to lock down and restrict access to that particular column and only allow it to be viewed by users who are part of that HR group. Now, when it comes to column-level security, it does operate slightly differently to row-level security in 2 key ways. So first up, there is currently no anonymous approach to column-level security, so you can only restrict based on users or groups. Additionally, when we configure column-level security, we don't do so via a rules data set like we did with row-level security. Instead, we define the security rules for each column in our data set. So that you can see in this screenshot, this is what it looks like. We have a checkbox next to the columns, and by default, everyone who can access the data set can access all of the columns. But if we want to, we can come in here and we can select fields and specify that they can only be accessed by certain users or certain groups. Doing so can help us to restrict data access and ensure that confidential data is viewable only by the users who have a need to see it. Now, we're going to change gears slightly and move away from the data security space into our user management perspective. Within QuickSight, we have 3 different types of users. We've got admins, authors, and readers. Now, admins are the users who are in charge of managing our QuickSight account. These are the users who manage other users in the account, they set up those VPC connections we spoke about earlier, and they define the resources that QuickSight can connect to. Next up, we have author users, and these users can create assets within our account, so dashboards, analyses, data sets. And just to be clear, these actions can also be performed by admins as well. But our final users, readers, they can simply consume these assets either by accessing a dashboard, via an email report, or alternatively, if we've got Q enabled in our account, these readers can ask questions of their data using that Q search bar. Now, often these 3 user types are more than enough for us to organize our different user requirements. However, there are times where we might want to provide more fine-grained access controls. So for enterprise accounts using either IAM federated identities or IAM federated identities and QuickSight managed users, we can achieve this through a concept called custom permissions. With custom permissions, we can create a list of restricted actions that can enable us to lock down access and restrict our user permissions at a more granular level. So these could be actions such as creating data sources, running anomaly detection jobs, or even creating shared folders and email reports. With custom permissions, we can define the actions we do not want our users to be able to perform. These permissions can then be applied to our users and will override the default QuickSight user type permissions. Now, a common use case we see with custom permissions involves restricting the BI analyst teams within our QuickSight accounts. Often, these teams, they need to create analyses and dashboards which can be shared with other teams. However, we only want them to be able to build these analyses off pre-curated data sets. We want to restrict them from being able to create and connect to their own unvetted data sources. So, to achieve this, we can set up a custom permission policy that removes the ability to create data sets as well as data sources within QuickSight. Once we have this permission set up, we can then assign it to our BI analysts. And from there, they won't be able to create their own data sets. Instead, they'll be restricted to only working with data sets that we have explicitly shared with them in advance. And like before, when we were speaking about row-level and column-level security, these custom permissions can help us to ensure that we're meeting the principle of least privilege. And what that really means is we want to have our users, we only want to give them the correct actions and access to resources that are necessary for them to do their job and nothing more. And really the reason behind that is because we want to minimize the attack surface within our account. Now, next up, and still focusing on how we can actually secure our users' access, we're going to quickly look into how we can leverage IP restrictions within our QuickSight account. Now, IP restrictions are a fairly easy way for us to actually configure and secure where our users can connect to QuickSight from. So as an admin within QuickSight, we can define a list of IP addresses that we have approved to access QuickSight. And I do want to specify that these IP restrictions will impact users accessing the QuickSight web portal, QuickSight mobile applications on iOS and Android, as well as any embedded QuickSight pages that we've configured. However, these IP restrictions won't impact any API calls being made by our users. So what this means is if you've got certain admin users and they might be performing actions such as registering users or managing assets via APIs, they will not be impacted by any of these IP restrictions that we configure. So if you do want to lock down these API actions, to do this, you can actually go through a separate approach, and you need to leverage the AWS source IP condition. And this is a condition available within your AWS IAM policies. Once you have this in place, you can then attach it to the user making those API calls and specify that an action can only be allowed if it's coming from a particular source IP. Once you've done that, any of your users who are making those API calls will be prevented or restricted unless they've got the correct IP it's coming from. But back to our IP restrictions within QuickSight. So as an admin, we can set up rules, basically say that only access can come from certain source IP addresses. These rules can be configured either via the admin management within the console that you can see here in the screenshot, or alternatively, we can do so using the Update IP Restriction API to configure these rules programmatically. So hopefully you can already see the benefit that can come from using these IP restrictions. They help us to ensure that our QuickSight accounts can only be accessed from authorized users and devices. Now, quite often our customers will go with IP restrictions to ensure that users within their organization can actually only access QuickSight from within the company's office or from remote private networks. Now, when it does come to actually configuring our IP restrictions, there are a few items to be aware of. So once you've configured an IP rule, it applies globally and across all AWS regions. Additionally, once you configure an IP rule, and once you're about to save it, you need to make sure that you have actually approved and put in your own IP address. And if you are configuring these IP restrictions on the console, QuickSight won't actually let you save these changes until you've got a rule in place that includes your own IP address. And this is to prevent you being locked out of your own QuickSight account. So just do keep that in mind. With that said, let's head along to our next security best practice. Now, namespaces was a concept that I tossed and turned about, including in today's session. But if you are an ISV offering self-service authoring to your customers, or even if you're just an organization interested in containing and isolating your various departments and teams, namespaces is definitely a construct that you should be aware of. So within QuickSight, namespaces are these logical containers that we can use to organize and segregate out our users. So by default, when you are working within a QuickSight account, you are doing so in what's known as a default namespace. However, if you have authenticated your QuickSight account using either IAM federated identities or IAM federated identities and QuickSight managed users, you do have the option to set up additional custom namespaces in your account. So you can use these namespaces to separate out your different users. So if you were an ISV and you provided self-service authoring to your end users, you might have an architecture that you can see on the screen here. So in this environment, you've got your default namespace, and this is where your BI team would actually create and share out those dashboards across all of your customers. But you would also have these additional custom namespaces, so one namespace per tenant. So your users who belong to customer 1, they'd be created in namespace 1, while users who belong to customer 2 would be created in namespace 2 that you can see here. Now, with namespaces, all of your author users that you've created in namespace 1, they can create and they can share out assets with other users or groups only if they are created and part of namespace 1. So an author namespace 1 is actually unable to share any dashboards, any analyses with users outside of this namespace, so they can't share it with the user in namespace 2 or in the default namespace. So I want to pause here and make something really clear. Namespaces are a construct that you should really only be leveraging if you're an ISV and you're giving your users self-service dashboard creation, or if you want to restrict who your users can see and share assets with. If you are simply giving your users reader permissions to view dashboards, leveraging row and column level security that we spoke to before, or just creating separate dashboards for these different users, depending on how your data tenancy model is defined, is going to be more than sufficient to secure and ensure your tenancies are isolated. The only reason we have namespaces is because once you make a user an author user within QuickSight, if they want to share something, they can search and they can see all of the users within your namespace. So ideally, you don't want to have a user in namespace 2 be able to identify and see users that are in a different namespace or a different organization. So it's really important, if you are going with this approach, multi-tenancy, that you do leverage namespaces really just to give that separate isolation for your different users. Or even if you just want to separate out your internal users, namespaces can be very beneficial. Now, with that said, we're going to quickly jump into our last security best practice for today, and that is all around monitoring. Now, up until this point, we have been speaking about preventative measures that can be used to secure our QuickSight environment. So we've been focusing on ensuring we've got the proper guardrails within our QuickSight accounts to protect both our data and our users. But what happens if we miss something, or if we had a malicious actor who managed to gain access into our accounts? In situations like that, it is really important that we've got insight into all of the activity that's happening within our QuickSight accounts. So doing so will actually allow us to be alerted if there are any potential malicious activities, so we can spot these issues quickly and then proactively remediate and help prevent anything else happening. Now, when it does come to monitoring our resources, there's one tool in particular we are going to focus on, and that is AWS CloudTrail. So if you have listened to any of our security monitoring talks here at AWS, AWS CloudTrail will not be a new service to you. So CloudTrail, if you aren't aware of it, so it is a fully managed service within AWS, and it does provide monitoring across our AWS resources, including QuickSight. So with CloudTrail, user activity, including API calls, these are all recorded, and these activities include details like the user who made the request, what the actions were, as well as what the returned response was. So it's very beneficial for giving us insight into the activities that have been happening within our accounts and across our resources. So in terms of QuickSight, we can use this CloudTrail integration, and we can be alerted if a user creates a new dashboard in production, or even if, let's say, a data set is shared, so the permissions on a data set are actually updated to include a new user or group, we can have a complete audit trail of all of these activities. And this makes it really easy for us to investigate if any security incidents happen, as well as troubleshoot if we identify any issues. Now, if you are interested in learning more about how QuickSight can integrate with CloudTrail, one of our QuickSight solution architects, Ramon Lopez, actually did a session on this exact topic at last week's QuickSight Learning series. So I would very highly recommend checking out that session on our QuickSight YouTube channel, where he goes through a lot more detail into the different solutions that can be leveraged and how CloudTrail can be used to help us monitor and get observability into our QuickSight resources. But with that said, it's time to do a really quick recap and just look at everything that we've spoken about today. So we began this session focusing on the different data security options that we have available. So we touched on the different types of encryption options. So this included encryption in transit. And we spoke about how while the majority of our QuickSight data sources have SSL enforced, when we are connecting to certain databases, it is important that we opt to use SSL if it's not already configured. And we need to remember that we must work with a certificate that has been signed by a publicly recognized certificate authority. We then spoke about the options available for encrypting our data in rest, and how a QuickSight enterprise license can give us encryption at rest. But if we wanted to build on this and actually manage our own keys, we can opt to encrypt our data using our own AWS KMS customer keys. We also spoke about how, as a best practice, we can use Secrets Manager to securely store and manage our secrets. So doing so really can allow us to ensure that our data is protected and make sure that only authorized users and applications can access it, as well as prevent our BI users needing to remember or have access to credentials when creating those data sources. We then looked into how we can use VPC connections to securely connect to our data stored in our AWS VPCs or databases that might be hosted on premises, and how doing so can allow us to ensure our resources aren't exposed to the public internet. Next up, we touched on both row-level security as well as column-level security and how these two different approaches can be used to ensure that our users have only got access to the data that they need to perform their jobs. We then jumped over from focusing on data to looking into our user access and how we can work with custom permissions if we want to provide more fine-grained control over our users. So if we wanted to restrict our authors from creating their own datasets or data sources, we could do so by leveraging custom permissions. We also spoke about IP restrictions and how we can use these if we want to restrict our users accessing QuickSight only from source IP addresses that we have confirmed and approved. Next up, we looked into namespaces as a way to isolate and segregate out our users and how this is really beneficial if we are ISVs and we want to prevent users from being able to search and share assets with users outside of their own organization. Now, our final best practice that we talked about was AWS CloudTrail, and that was a service that allowed us to gain insight into the activities happening within our QuickSight account and track the APIs that are being called so we can be alerted if any suspicious activity is identified or if any updates to dashboards or permissions goes on within our account. Now, we've covered quite a few different best practices, but please remember that these are guidelines and they do not represent a complete security solution. They are simply here to give you a starting point and help you on your way to securing your QuickSight account. Now, if you have got any questions about anything that we've spoken about, or if you want us to go into any more detail, please do reach out on our QuickSight community and we will be there to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been beneficial.
Thank you all for attending today's session on QuickSight Security Best Practices. You can sign up for our next week's session on our community. That will be on actually a new feature we have recently launched, that is QuickSight Dataset Parameter. Wednesday at 10 a.m. and Thursday, actually 10 a.m. Pacific time Wednesday and Thursday 10 a.m. Central European time. Another upcoming event is our virtual author immersion day for the European audience. That's 10 a.m. British Standard Time on Wednesday, May 24th. And you can go to the events page, which I walked you through earlier, to check this and other events. Thank you all for being present today. As a final request, requesting everyone to please provide feedback using the link I'm providing on the chat for this session so we can keep improving our sessions going forward and hear from you. Hope to see you all next week. Till then, have a good time.